Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The kind of sharp, unnatural wake-up where your eyes open and you're already alert before you even know why. My room was completely dark, and for a second I just lay there listening to my own breathing, trying to understand what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it. The shower was running. At first my brain tried to file it away as something normal. I glanced at my clock and saw it was just after 1 a.m. My brother worked night shifts, so my immediate thought was that he must have come home late and decided to shower before going to bed. That wasn't unusual for him. Sometimes he'd come in quietly and try not to wake anyone, and I'd only realize he was home because I'd hear the bathroom pipes or the creak of the hallway floor. So I rolled over, told myself everything made sense, and tried to fall back asleep. But once you notice a sound in the middle of the night, it's hard to unnotice it. The shower kept running steadily, a constant hiss of water against tile that echoed faintly through the house. It was louder than usual, or maybe it just felt louder because the rest of the world was so silent. Every little noise at night seems amplified. I pulled my blanket up and stared at the wall, listening. Minutes stretched. I remember thinking he was taking an awfully long shower. I tried to ignore it. I closed my eyes and focused on breathing slowly, but the sound drilled into my thoughts. The house felt different, like the air itself had changed. There's a strange heaviness that sometimes settles over a place at night, especially when you're half awake. My imagination started wandering. I pictured the bathroom light glowing under the door, steam fogging the mirror, water pooling at the bottom of the tub. It was such a clear image that I almost convinced myself I could smell soap in the air. After what felt like forever, I checked the clock again. Almost half an hour had passed. The shower was still going. That's when irritation mixed with the unease. I remember thinking, what the hell is he doing in there? We had an old water heater that would run out if someone stayed in too long. And I didn't want to wake up to a freezing shower in the morning because he decided to live in the bathroom at 1 a.m. I sat up, listening carefully. The house was otherwise dead quiet. No footsteps, no doors closing. Just that endless rushing water. A cold prickle crawled up the back of my neck, but I brushed it off. I told myself I was being dramatic. It was just my brother. People take long showers. That was it. Still, something felt off. Normally, I'd hear him moving around, coughing, dropping something, opening drawers. There was none of that. Just the water. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The floor was cold. My room felt darker than usual, like the shadows were thicker. I hesitated for a second, staring at my door, and I actually laughed quietly at myself. I felt stupid for being nervous in my own house. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The sound of the shower immediately got louder. It echoed down the hall in a way that made the house feel empty and hollow. Every step I took creaked. I walked slowly, partly because I was still half asleep and partly because A knot of anxiety had formed in my stomach. The bathroom door was slightly open, and I could see light spilling into the hallway. "Hey!" I called out, my voice low and rough from sleep. "You gonna be in there all night?" No answer. I waited, expecting some annoyed reply, but there was nothing. Just the shower. The silence around it felt thick, like the house was holding its breath. I walked closer and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty. The shower curtain was half drawn, and water was blasting full force into the tub. Steam filled the room, fogging the mirror and clinging to the ceiling. The light hummed softly overhead. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I just stood there, staring at the empty space where someone should have been. I said my brother's name louder this time, thinking maybe he'd stepped out for a towel or something. No response. I checked the sink area, the toilet, even pulled the curtain back fully like an idiot, expecting someone to be hiding behind it. There was no one. The water kept roaring. A chill spread through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I reached in and turned the shower off with a shaking hand. The sudden silence was deafening. Without the water, the house felt enormous and wrong. I stood there dripping sweat in the humid air, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. I backed out of the bathroom slowly and looked down the hallway toward my brother's room. His door was open. The room was dark and empty. His bed was untouched. My chest tightened. I grabbed my phone and checked the time again, then opened our messages. He was still at work. He hadn't come home. I walked through the entire house, turning on lights as I went. Every corner, every closet. I even checked the front and back doors to make sure they were locked. They were. The windows were shut. There was no sign that anyone had been there except me. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the handle was loose. Maybe the pipes did something weird. Old houses make noises. Old plumbing acts up. I repeated those thoughts like a mantra, but they didn't stick. The image of that empty bathroom with the shower running kept replaying in my head. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I sat in my room with the lights on, phone in my hand, jumping at every tiny sound. The house settled and creaked the way houses do, but now every noise felt intentional. Like footsteps I just couldn't quite catch. I kept staring at my doorway, convinced I'd see a shadow move across it. When my brother finally came home hours later, I nearly scared him by how fast I ran out to meet him. I told him what happened, trying to laugh it off as I explained, but he could tell I was shaken. He checked the bathroom, fiddled with the handle, and said maybe it had slipped or I'd dreamed it. But I know what I heard. I know I walked into that bathroom wide awake. The weirdest part is that nothing like it ever happened again. Not before, not after. The shower never turned on by itself. The handle never slipped. The plumbing worked perfectly fine. It was a single, isolated moment that made no sense and left no evidence behind. Almost 5 years have passed, and I still think about it more often than I want to admit. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and lie there listening to the silence, half expecting to hear water start running again. Every time the house makes a noise, my mind flashes back to that night. The memory hasn't faded. If anything, it's sharper because I've replayed it so many times trying to find an explanation. Even now, writing this, I can feel that same tightness in my chest. I'm glancing over my shoulder at dark corners like something might be standing there, just out of sight. It's ridiculous, and I know it is, but fear doesn't care about logic. There's something deeply unsettling about hearing a normal, everyday sound coming from an empty space. It twists your sense of reality just enough to make you question what you trust. I've told the story to friends, and they always try to rationalize it. Faulty plumbing, Sleepwalking? A trick of memory? I nod along because I want to believe them. I want a boring explanation. But late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, that certainty slips. I remember standing in that steamy bathroom, staring at an empty shower that should have had someone in it. I remember the silence after I turned it off. And every time I think about it too long, I end up doing the same thing I did that night, turning on more lights than I need, just to push the shadows back a little. It was supposed to be the gentle beginning of a relaxing trip, the kind you imagine for weeks beforehand. My boyfriend and I had just arrived in Ithaca, and I remember stepping out of the car feeling light and excited, like the world had opened up a little wider. Everything felt new in that clean, refreshing way only a new town can feel. The air smelled different, cooler and greener, and even the quiet seemed softer than back home. We had only been in town for about 10 minutes, barely enough time to orient ourselves, when we spotted a suspension bridge near Cornell's campus and decided to stop. It felt like the perfect quick detour, a scenic moment before we checked in and settled down. We were in that happy vacation mindset where every small choice feels like part of an adventure. I should say that heights and I have never gotten along. My fear isn't mild or manageable. It's the kind that crawls up your spine and makes your hands damp before you've even stepped onto anything high. My legs get weak. My stomach flips. And my brain starts imagining worst-case scenarios I know are unrealistic, but feel painfully real in the moment. Suspension bridges are at the top of my personal list of things I would rather avoid forever. Still, the view was supposed to be incredible, and I wanted to try. I didn't want to let fear control every decision I made, especially not on a trip that was supposed to be about enjoying life. My boyfriend knew how scared I was, and he didn't rush me. We stood at the start of the bridge while I stared out at it, letting the nerves settle just enough to move. The bridge stretched across the gorge in a long, thin line, swaying gently in the wind like it had its own quiet heartbeat. Through the gaps in the planks, you could see straight down, a dizzying drop that made my chest tighten. The air felt cooler up there, moving freely through the open space, brushing against my skin in steady waves. It was beautiful in a way that almost distracted me from the fear. The gorge opened wide beneath us, layered with rock and trees and shadow. Sunlight filtered through the leaves and caught the water far below, turning it into a ribbon of light. It looked like something from a postcard, calm and perfect, the kind of view people travel hours to see. He held my hand and talked to me the entire time, guiding me forward step by step. I focused on his voice instead of the height. I kept my eyes mostly ahead, breathing slowly, trying to match my pace to his words. Each step felt heavy and deliberate. Every small shift of the bridge made my heart jump, but I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't want to freeze. I didn't want to turn back and let the fear win. There was a strange pride in continuing, even while my body screamed at me to retreat. When we reached the middle of the bridge, we stopped. It was the best viewpoint, the place where the gorge opened the widest. The world felt suspended around us, the sky stretching above, the drop yawning below. For a moment, I forgot to be afraid. The scene was so quiet and beautiful that it pulled me out of my head. We decided to take a picture, wanting to capture that early vacation glow, that feeling of being somewhere new together. On the side we had come from, there was a small parking lot and a staircase leading down toward the gorge. It felt organized and contained, like there were clear edges and safe paths. The far side of the bridge looked different. It opened into trails that seemed to blend into the wild landscape, with fewer barriers between the path and the drop. I noticed the difference in passing, a small detail that barely registered at the time. While we were adjusting our phone and laughing about how awkward we looked, trying to balance it, a woman walked past us. She looked completely ordinary. Average height, casual clothes, nothing that stood out in any way. Her face was calm. She smiled at us in a friendly, open way and offered to take a picture. It was such a simple gesture, the kind travelers exchange all the time. We thanked her but declined, a little shy and not wanting to inconvenience her. She smiled again, warm and polite, and continued walking. There was no sign of distress in her expression, no hesitation in her stride. She walked with purpose, quick but smooth, heading toward the far side of the bridge like someone continuing an afternoon hike. I watched her casually, the way you do when you're only half paying attention, but still aware of the people around you. She reached the end of the bridge and stepped onto the trail. For a split second, my brain assumed she would turn or slow or look around. Instead, she moved forward in one continuous motion, and then she jumped. There was no build-up, no visible pause, no moment where she leaned over and looked down. She stepped as if the path simply continued into open air. My mind refused to understand what I was seeing. It felt wrong, like my eyes were lying to me. It looked like a glitch in reality, like someone walking through a door that didn't exist. The image didn't connect with meaning at first. It was just movement in the wrong direction. Then the sound reached us. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was heavy and blunt and final, a sickening impact that echoed up through the gorge and into the space around us. The sound didn't just hit my ears, it landed in my chest. It knocked the breath out of me. My hands went ice cold. My vision tunneled, the edges of the world fading while that moment stayed sharp and bright in the center. For a second, everything felt silent except for the ringing in my ears. The bridge, the wind, the distant voices, all of it vanished behind that single sound. My boyfriend grabbed my arm. I know he spoke, but the words didn't make sense. We both stared at the empty space where she had been standing. Well, there was nothing visible from our angle, just the gorge and the trees in the distance. But the emptiness felt louder than any scream. The bridge suddenly felt unbearable beneath my feet. The beauty of the view disappeared, replaced by a raw awareness of the drop. The height that had scared me earlier now felt cruel and enormous, like the landscape itself had turned hostile. I felt exposed standing there, suspended over that space, knowing what had just happened below. The air seemed heavier. The light looked different. The entire place felt changed. We moved without discussing it. Instinct took over. We crossed the rest of the bridge quickly, my fear of heights drowned out by shock. My body carried me forward automatically. I didn't look down again. I didn't want to see anything. I just wanted solid ground. When we stepped off the bridge, my legs shook like I had run a marathon. It felt like my body was trying to catch up to what my brain had just witnessed. Around us, people were beginning to react. Some had seen everything. Others were confused, asking what happened. Voices overlapped in a rising wave of panic and disbelief. Someone pulled out a phone with trembling hands. Someone else started crying. The peaceful sounds of a scenic overlook dissolved into chaos. The normal world had been interrupted, and no one knew how to return to it. What haunted me most wasn't the act itself. It was how ordinary she had seemed. She smiled at us. She offered a small kindness in what must have been the final minute of her life. There was no warning in her face, no visible crack in the calm surface she showed the world. Just a woman walking across a bridge on a beautiful day. That smile replayed in my mind over and over in the weeks that followed. It felt impossible to reconcile that gentle expression with what came seconds later. Even now, years later, I still think about her sometimes, about how close we were in that brief intersection of our lives. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her story. I will never know what brought her to that moment. But for a few seconds, our paths crossed in a way that permanently marked my memory. It's strange how a person you never truly knew can leave such a deep imprint. The sound is what lingers the longest. People often talk about images that stay with them, but for me, it's the sound that returns unexpectedly. It slips into quiet moments, sharp and clear as if no time has passed. It didn't belong in that beautiful place. It shattered the illusion that scenic landscapes exist separately from human pain. That day taught me that suffering can stand right beside beauty, invisible until it isn't. Afterward, the rest of the trip felt muted. We went through the motions of sightseeing and eating out and exploring, but a thin layer of sadness covered everything. I found myself watching strangers more closely, wondering what they carried inside. The experience didn't make me afraid of people. It made me aware of how fragile everyone is. Every person you pass has a hidden world behind their eyes. You never know what battle is unfolding quietly inside them. You never know when a simple smile might be the last kindness they offer. We had been in Ithaca for only 10 minutes when it happened. 10 minutes into what was supposed to be a carefree vacation. And I left with a memory that will stay with me for the rest of my life. A reminder of how suddenly reality can shift. One moment you are laughing on a bridge, worrying about a fear of heights. The next, you are standing in the aftermath of something that changes how you see the world. That contrast is what stays with me. The closeness of joy and tragedy. The thin line between an ordinary day and a moment that echoes forever. It happened a few years ago during what was supposed to be one of the coolest experiences of my life. A night scuba dive. I had done plenty of daytime dives before and felt comfortable in the water, but night diving had this extra edge to it. Everyone tells you it's peaceful, magical even, because the ocean changes after dark. Different creatures come out. The reef feels alive in a completely different way. I signed up excited, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a knot of nervous energy in my stomach the entire afternoon leading up to it. There were 8 of us in the group, including the dive master and his assistant. We met on the boat just after sunset. The sky was fading from orange to deep blue, and the water below us looked like a sheet of ink. Standing there in full gear, listening to the briefing, I remember staring at that darkness and feeling small. During the day, you can see the ocean. At night, it feels like you're stepping into something endless. The dive master went over the plan carefully. Stay close. Keep your lights visible. Don't wander. At night, your flashlight isn't just for seeing. It's how the group stays connected. Without it, you disappear instantly. His voice was calm and steady, the kind of tone that makes you trust someone immediately. That helped more than he probably knew. When we rolled backward off the boat and hit the water, the world changed in an instant. The surface noise vanished. All the sounds of the boat, the wind, everything above us faded into a muffled hum. It was just bubbles, breathing, and darkness. When I switched on my dive light, a bright cone of white cut through the black water, and tiny particles floated in the beam like dust in a sunbeam, except we were suspended in it. The descent felt slow and deliberate. The reef appeared gradually, shapes emerging from nothing. Colors that looked dull during the day seemed electric under the lights. Fish moved lazily in and out of our beams, some startled by the sudden brightness, others completely indifferent. It was surreal and beautiful. The fear I'd carried with me melted into awe. I remember thinking this was exactly why people fall in love with diving. We explored for a while, staying tight as a group. The dive master floated ahead, occasionally pointing things out. A sleeping turtle wedged into a rock, a lobster creeping along the reef, a cluster of glowing plankton that sparkled when disturbed. Time felt strange down there. Without a horizon or sky, it was just us and the water. Eventually, our tanks were running low and it was time to head up. We gathered in a loose circle, hovering above the reef, doing our final checks before ascending. Everyone's lights overlapped, creating a bright bubble in the darkness. Outside that circle, the ocean was pitch black. It felt like we were sitting in a tiny island of visibility, surrounded by an infinite void. That's when the dive master froze. It was subtle at first. He stopped moving and angled his body slightly, like he'd noticed something. His light swung away from the group and stabbed into the darkness. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The beam caught a shape that moved just at the edge of visibility. Smooth, controlled. Then it came into full view. A shark. Not a small one. Not the kind you joke about seeing from a safe distance. This thing was massive. Later, we estimated it at around 12 feet long. A great white. Its body slid through the water with terrifying grace, muscles rippling under pale skin. It wasn't rushing us. It was circling. My heart slammed so hard I felt it in my throat. There's a special kind of fear that comes when your brain realizes you're in the food chain. Every instinct screams at you to run, but there's nowhere to run to. We were suspended in open water far from the surface, surrounded by darkness. The shark moved just outside our ring of light, dipping in and out like it was testing the boundary. The dive master signaled urgently for everyone to keep their lights on it. Half the group turned their beams outward, tracking the shark as it circled. The water lit up with crisscrossing white cones. Every time the light hit its eyes, they flashed back cold and reflective. It never charged, it never sped up. It just kept circling, patient and curious. What shocked me most was how calm everyone stayed. No one bolted, no one thrashed. Panic underwater can kill you faster than anything else, and somehow the training held. We hovered there, breathing loud and fast in our regulators, but controlled. My mind, however, was chaos. Two thoughts looped over and over like a broken record. Don't look like a seal, and I hope I taste terrible. It sounds ridiculous, but in that moment it felt like the only humor my brain could generate to keep from cracking. The shark passed close enough once that I could see the detail of its skin. Scars, texture, the slow sweep of its tail pushing water with effortless power. It was beautiful in a way that made the fear even sharper. This wasn't a monster from a movie. It was an animal perfectly built for its world, and we were visitors who suddenly felt very out of place. The dive master caught our attention again. He moved slowly, deliberately, making eye contact with each of us. Then he gave the signal, thumb up, ascend. But he didn't shoot upward. He mimed the motion carefully, emphasizing slow, controlled. Together, we began to rise as a group. Every instinct wanted to rocket to the surface, but we followed his lead. Our bubbles streamed upward in silver columns. The shark adjusted instantly, rising with us. It stayed just outside the lights, matching our pace. The idea that it was choosing to stay with us sent a fresh wave of fear through my chest. I kept my light locked on it, unwilling to lose sight of where it was. The water grew lighter above us, a faint gray hinting at the surface. My ears popped as we ascended. My breathing sounded thunderous in my head. I was hyper-aware of every movement of my fins, terrified of splashing or looking injured. I wanted to be the most boring, unappetizing thing in the ocean. At around 10 feet from the surface, the shark slowed. It made one final pass around the circle, its body turning in a smooth arc. For a second, it was fully illuminated, suspended in all our lights at once. It looked enormous, ancient, completely at home. Then, with a flick of its tail, it angled away. It vanished into the darkness like it had never been there. One moment, we were being watched by a predator, older than human memory. The next, there was nothing but empty water. We hung there for a heartbeat, stunned, lights searching for a shape that didn't return. Then the dive master gestured upward again, and we finished the ascent. Breaking the surface felt like being reborn. Air hit my face. The boat lights seemed blinding after the dark below. Hands grabbed my gear and helped me aboard. The second I was sitting safely on deck, my body started shaking. The adrenaline that had stayed locked down underwater finally released. Everyone started talking at once, voices overlapping, half laughing, half swearing. We replayed it in fragments. Did you see how big it was? It stayed the whole time. It was right there. The dive master stayed calm even then, but I could see the tension leaving his shoulders. He told us we'd done everything right. Stayed together, stayed controlled. He said the shark was curious, not hunting. I nodded along, but my body didn't care about the explanation. All it knew was that something with the power to end me had chosen not to. When I got home that night, I lay awake replaying the image of it circling in the dark. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale shape just beyond the light. The ocean had always felt like a playground to me before that. Afterward, it felt different, deeper, wilder, more honest about what it contained. I didn't go back into the ocean for a week. Even standing on the shore made my chest tighten. I'd watch the waves and imagine what moved beneath them, unseen and silent. Eventually, I forced myself back in, because I didn't want fear to win. The first dive after that was tense, every shadow suspicious. But little by little, the love of the water returned. Still, I've never forgotten that circle of light in the darkness, and the shape that moved just beyond it. It was a reminder that the ocean isn't ours. We visit it on borrowed time, guests in a place ruled by creatures perfectly designed for it. And for a few long minutes that night, we were allowed to leave unharmed. Not because we were safe, but because we were spared. I used to work at a trailer park my parents owned. It wasn't glamorous work by any means, but it was steady, and it gave me an up-close view of how people lived when life had gotten messy. The park had its fair share of trouble. Quite often, tenants would get caught up in drugs, usually methamphetamine. Inevitably, that would lead to them falling behind on rent, arguments would flare, and eventually, they'd get evicted. My parents had a system for dealing with the trailers themselves. By the time someone was being evicted, their trailer was usually in terrible shape. Floors rotted, walls scuffed and burned from cigarettes, furniture smashed, plumbing non-functional. It was easier to just buy the trailer from the evicted tenant and tear it down than try to fix it. At first, the work was straightforward. Remove the junk, I'd sort out anything salvageable, and then demolish the trailer. But after a while, I began noticing something that made me uneasy every single time. The children's rooms. Many of these tenants had kids, and it became painfully obvious as I moved through these homes that the children had suffered in ways no one should. More than half of the trailers I cleaned out had rooms where the doors were locked from the outside. The locks weren't decorative or modern. They were makeshift, sometimes metal hasps that had been welded or screwed into place, old padlocks, or even nails hammered in through the frame. Whoever had lived there clearly didn't want the children to leave the rooms, at least not unsupervised. Inside, the rooms were always terrifying in a subtle way. It wasn't just the mess. It was what the mess told me. The floor corners were coated in filth, and there were areas that clearly served as bathroom corners, evidence that the children had been left there for long stretches, sometimes days without proper care. The doors themselves were often scarred. I would run my hand along the edges and see scratches, small claw marks and gouges where the children had probably tried to escape. Sometimes there were faint, faded marks on the walls at eye level for a child, like desperate attempts to leave a message, to signal someone, anything. What always shook me the most was getting ready to start clearing out the stuff. Every time, I felt my heart rate pick up. Moving furniture, pushing aside broken toys, and opening drawers and closets filled with decades of human debris. It was disgusting work, yes, but it also carried the unshakable fear that I might find something worse. I couldn't stop imagining the unthinkable. Maybe a child had died in here, hidden somewhere among the mess, behind a mattress, under a pile of dirty clothes. Every step I took in those rooms, every box I moved, every drawer I opened carried that possibility. I never found anything like that, thank God, but I couldn't ignore the odds that someone might have been trapped, neglected, or worse. Even after leaving the trailer park, the memory of those rooms stayed with me. It wasn't just the filth or the damage, it was the atmosphere. The silent echoes of lives lived in fear and neglect. The scratches on the doors, the locks on the outside, the tiny corners used as toilets. It all painted a picture of something horrific. I still remember standing in the middle of one of those rooms, flashlight in hand, surrounded by piles of broken toys and filthy mattresses, and just feeling the weight of the lives that had passed through there. You could almost hear the faintest whispers of fear in the air, and I would shiver every single time. Even now, years later, I can picture those rooms vividly. I can see the scratches on the door frames, the faded handprints on the walls, the empty cribs and torn bedding. It's not something I could ever unsee. It was a glimpse into a world of real human horror. The kind you don't see on TV or in movies. And while I never actually found a child harmed beyond repair, the thought that it might have happened, and the very real signs of abuse and neglect, have haunted me long after those trailers were torn down. It's strange to think about now, but every trailer I demolished wasn't just a pile of trash. It was a reminder of lives disrupted, of innocence trapped in places it didn't belong. And as I worked through the filth, moving broken toys and shattered furniture aside, I realized that the most terrifying part wasn't the mess itself. It was what it said about the people who had lived there and the children who had suffered in silence. Even today, I feel a chill remembering those rooms. The locks, the scratches, the faint, lingering smell of neglect. It all comes back to me in a way that makes my stomach twist. It's a memory that's impossible to shake. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes they're the traces of real human cruelty, hiding behind a door, waiting for someone to notice. It happened on a night that should have been completely routine, the kind of night I'd lived through 100 times before, without a second thought. I was out in the middle of a field working on an old Gleaner K2 combine, fixing a belt that had jumped while I was running it. It was late, well past the hour when most people in town were asleep. Out there, though, time feels different. When you work land and machines, you get used to long stretches of darkness and silence. Usually it's peaceful. That night it wasn't. The darkness was thick, the kind that presses in on you from every direction. There were no streetlights, no houses close by, no distant glow from a city. Just open field and sky. My flashlight was almost dead, throwing out a weak yellow circle that barely reached a few feet in front of me. Every time I moved it, the shadows seemed to jump and rearrange themselves. The combine loomed over me like a giant skeleton of metal and belts, creaking softly as it cooled. My dog Cooper was with me like he always was. He was a massive Labrador, about 110 pounds of muscle and loyalty. Normally, when I stopped to fix something, he'd wander off a little, sniffing around, chasing scents, maybe watching birds or mice in the rows. He never strayed far. He liked being close, keeping an eye on me. His presence was comforting out there. Even if I didn't think about it consciously, I always felt less alone when he was nearby. I was crouched down, hands greasy, focused on getting the belt back into place when I realized everything had gone quiet. It wasn't a normal quiet. Fields at night are never silent. There are insects, distant animal calls, wind through stalks. This was different. It felt like the world had paused and was holding its breath. That's when I noticed Cooper. He wasn't moving. He stood a few yards away, rigid as a statue. His ears were forward, his body angled toward the darkness beyond the flashlight's reach. The hair along his back was raised. A low growl rolled out of him, so deep I felt it more than heard it. In all the years I'd had him, I had never heard that sound come out of him before. It wasn't playful, and it wasn't a warning bark. It was pure instinct, the sound of an animal recognizing danger. My stomach tightened. I slowly stood and turned the flashlight in the direction he was staring. The beam shook in my hand. At first, I didn't see anything, just rows of crops and darkness layered behind them. Then the light caught something reflective. Eyes. 2 bright points floating in the black. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then another pair lit up a few feet to the left, and another, and another. The beam wobbled as my hand started to tremble. The shadows shifted, and shapes emerged around those glowing eyes. Coyotes. Not 1 or 2. A pack. I counted at least 5, maybe more hidden deeper in the dark. They weren't barking or yipping. They were silent, moving in a loose circle. Coyotes are usually cautious around people. I'd seen them plenty of times. They run off the second they notice you. But these weren't running. They were watching, calculating. The way they spread out told me exactly what they were doing. They were hunting, and we were in the middle of their circle. A cold wave of fear washed through me. I'd heard stories about what a pack could do when they committed to an attack. They don't rush in blindly. They test. They distract. They separate their target. And once they commit, it's relentless. I called Cooper's name, trying to keep my voice steady. I told him to come back to the cab. My plan was simple. Get him inside, get myself inside, slam the door, wait it out. But he didn't listen. He stepped forward instead, barking and snarling, putting himself between me and the pack. Every instinct he had was telling him to defend. My heart dropped. If he stayed out there alone, they'd tear him apart before I could blink. I grabbed the hammer from my work bag without really thinking. My mind was running on pure survival. I shrugged out of my thick jacket and wrapped it tight around my forearm, creating a crude shield. My flashlight beam danced wildly as I moved, catching flashes of fur and teeth. The coyotes edged closer, testing the distance. The first one lunged so fast I barely saw it move. It came low, aiming for my leg. Instinct took over. I shoved my wrapped arm toward it. Its jaws clamped down on the jacket with a violent snap. The force of it rattled my bones. I brought the hammer down with everything I had. The impact sent a shock up my arm. The coyote yelped and released, scrambling back into the dark. There was no pause. Another one came in immediately, teeth flashing in the weak light. I swung again, panic and adrenaline fueling the blow. It connected, and the animals skidded away, disappearing into the circle. The rest shifted their focus. They rushed Cooper. I saw them trying to split him from me, darting in and out, snapping at his sides. He fought like a demon, barking and biting, but there were too many of them. One grabbed his shoulder and tried to drag him toward the crops. The sound he made tore straight through me. It wasn't a bark, it was pain. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed another tool without even looking and hurled it at the pack. It clattered uselessly into the dirt. They barely flinched. I charged forward and kicked the one holding him with all my strength. My boot connected, and it let go, scrambling backward. I swung the hammer wildly at another shape, lunging toward him. The metal whistled through the air. That one retreated too. For a second, everything hung suspended. Then the pack broke. They melted back into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. One moment they were there, eyes glowing, bodies circling. The next, the field was empty again. Only the echo of my breathing and Cooper's ragged panting filled the air. He limped back to me, sides heaving. Under the weak flashlight, I could see scratches and blood, matted in his fur. My hands shook as I dropped the hammer and knelt beside him. I ran my fingers over his body, searching for deep bites. He leaned into me, tail giving a weak thump, trusting me completely, even after everything. The adrenaline drained out of me all at once, leaving me dizzy and sick. My legs felt like they might give out. I hugged him, pressing my face into his neck, whispering nonsense just to hear my own voice. The field felt enormous and hostile around us. I suddenly wanted nothing more than to get as far away from that darkness as possible. I got him into the cab and drove like hell. The entire ride I kept glancing at him, terrified I'd missed something. Coyotes carry diseases. Rabies was the word that kept flashing in my mind like a warning light. Even if the wounds looked small, the danger wasn't over. At the vet, they treated him, cleaned him up, gave him shots. They told me to watch for changes in behavior. I nodded, pretending I wasn't already imagining the worst. For a few days, he seemed okay, sore, tired, but still my Cooper. I let myself believe we'd gotten lucky, that the night would fade into a scary story I'd tell later with a nervous laugh. Then he started to change. It was subtle at first. Restlessness, a strange edge in his eyes. He'd snap at things that never bothered him before. The vet confirmed what I was afraid of. Despite the treatment, something had taken hold. Hearing the words felt like being hit all over again. We'd survived the attack, but we hadn't escaped it. The decision that followed was the hardest thing I've ever made. Sitting in that room with him, holding his head in my hands, I kept replaying the field in my mind. The glowing eyes, the circle tightening. The moment I thought I was going to lose him right there in the dirt, I had fought like hell to bring him home, and now I was the one saying goodbye. When it was over, the silence felt heavier than that field ever had. Years have passed, but that night still lives in me. Sometimes it comes back in flashes. The low growl in Cooper's chest, the snap of jaws on my arm, the thud of the hammer. I'll hear an animal cry in the distance or see movement in the corner of my eye and feel my heart spike before I even understand why. What stays with me most isn't just the fear. It's the intensity of that instinct to protect. In that moment, there was no hesitation, no calculation, just action. Love stripped down to something raw and animal. I learned that night how thin the line is between ordinary life and chaos. One minute you're fixing a machine under a quiet sky. The next you're fighting in the dark for someone you love. Whenever I think about Cooper, I don't picture the end. I picture him standing in that field, fur raised, placing himself between me and the pack without a second thought. Brave and stubborn and loyal to the core. The darkness felt endless that night, but so did the bond between us. And sometimes, when I'm out late and the world goes quiet in that same unnatural way, I still half expect to see a ring of glowing eyes waiting just beyond the light. My parents bought their first house in 1972, long before I was born. They used to tell the story like it was the beginning of their real adult life together. It wasn't a perfect house. It was a fixer-upper in the truest sense, the kind of place that needed work in every room. The floors were worn, the walls were uneven, and nothing matched. But it was theirs. They didn't have much money, so they made the decision to move in immediately and repair things slowly as time and savings allowed. At first, the house felt like a project full of promise. They were young and excited, walking through each room and imagining what it could become. Within the first few days of moving in, the neighbors came by to introduce themselves. Back then, that was the normal thing. People showed up with smiles and casual conversation, curious about who the new couple was. The talk started friendly enough, but eventually it drifted toward the previous owners. The neighbors explained that the last family had left after a very ugly divorce. There had been a tragedy in that house. The couple had lost their second baby to SIDS. The stress and grief tore them apart, and the marriage collapsed not long after. The neighbors didn't say it in a dramatic way. It was more like quiet, sad gossip passed along as background information. Still, the words landed heavy. My parents were deeply shaken when they heard it. The timing couldn't have been worse. My mom was newly pregnant with her first child. The thought of losing a baby wasn't abstract to her. It was immediate and personal. She later said she could feel the fear settle in her chest the moment the neighbors told them. The house suddenly carried a history they hadn't asked for. It wasn't just walls and floors anymore. It was a place where something awful had happened. For a while, that knowledge lingered in the air. Every creak and shadow felt loaded with meaning. But life has a way of moving forward, whether you want it to or not. Days turned into weeks, and the house slowly started to feel like theirs. They painted rooms, replaced fixtures, and argued playfully over colors and furniture. The excitement of expecting a baby began to outweigh the unease tied to the house's past. Eventually, the story of the previous family faded into the background. They focused on preparing for the nursery. That room became my mom's obsession. She wanted it perfect. She picked out wallpaper she loved, soft and cheerful, something that felt hopeful and safe. My dad, practical as always, tried to cut corners where he could. He told her there was no reason to wallpaper inside the closet. No one would see it. It was extra work for no benefit. My mom refused to compromise. She said if they were doing the room, they were doing all of it. The closet was part of the nursery, and she wanted every inch fresh and new. So one afternoon, she knelt inside that small closet with a scraper in her hand, determined to remove the old paint before hanging the wallpaper. The space was tight and dusty. The air smelled like old wood and plaster. She worked slowly, focused on the repetitive motion. At some point, she paused to rest her hand. Her eyes drifted across the inside wall, and that's when she saw it. At first, her brain didn't understand what she was looking at. It was just a few lines of color breaking through the dull paint. But as she leaned closer, the shapes became letters. The letters became words. Written in crayon at a height that matched the eye level of a small child was a message in uneven, childish handwriting. I killed the baby. The words were jagged and crooked, the kind of scrawl you'd expect from a kindergartner still learning how to hold a crayon. The colors had faded slightly with time, but they were still unmistakable. For a moment, my mom couldn't breathe. She later described it as feeling like ice water had been poured straight into her veins. Her hands went numb. The scraper slipped from her fingers and clattered softly against the floor. All she could do was stare. The sentence sat there, silent and final, carved into her vision. Her mind instantly connected it to the story the neighbors had told. The lost child, the broken marriage, the grief that had filled the house before they ever stepped inside it. She felt the room shrink around her. The closet walls seemed closer, the air heavier. She scrambled backward out of the closet on shaking hands and knees. When she stood up, her legs barely held her. She called for my dad, her voice thin and unsteady. He came down the hall expecting a normal question about paint or wallpaper. Instead, he found her pale and trembling, pointing toward the nursery. He stepped into the closet and saw it too. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The childish confession hung there between them, impossible to ignore. My dad tried to rationalize it out loud. Maybe it was a cruel joke from a neighborhood kid. Maybe it had nothing to do with the family that lived there before. Kids write shocking things without understanding them. He kept talking, not because he believed his own explanations, but because silence made it worse. My mom couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was whispering something terrible. She was pregnant, already vulnerable, already afraid of the idea of losing a child. Seeing those words felt like a direct attack on her deepest fear. The logical part of her brain knew a child's crayon message couldn't actually carry power. But emotion doesn't listen to logic. It reacts to symbols, to timing, to the way coincidence can feel like fate. They covered the writing that same day. My dad sanded the wall down until the crayon marks disappeared completely. Then they painted over it, layer after layer, until there was no trace left. He treated it like a repair job. My mom treated it like an exorcism. She stood in the doorway watching every stroke of the brush, needing to see the words erased with her own eyes. Even after it was gone, the memory lingered. For weeks, she avoided being alone in that room. Every time she stepped inside, she could still see the sentence in her mind, bright and ugly against the wall. She worried constantly about the baby. Every small ache or unfamiliar sensation sent her spiraling into panic. The house no longer felt entirely safe. It felt marked by a story she couldn't escape. Over time, though, the fear softened. The nursery filled with furniture, clothes, and soft light. New memories layered over the old ones. When the baby was born healthy, a huge weight lifted off her chest. The house transformed again, and this time into a place of laughter and sleepless nights, and the chaos of new parenthood. Life claimed the space so completely that the crayon message started to feel like something from another lifetime. Still, she never forgot it. Years later, she would tell the story in a quieter voice, like she was sharing a secret. Not because she believed anything supernatural was attached to the house, but because of how deeply it shook her in that moment. It was the collision of tragedy and timing, fear and imagination. A child's careless words intersecting with a grieving history, and a pregnant woman's vulnerability. The house stood for decades after that, filled with birthdays and arguments and ordinary days. Nothing else strange ever happened there. No signs of lingering darkness. Just a family living their lives. But that one discovery remained a scar in the memory of the place. A reminder that houses carry pieces of the people who lived in them before. Traces you don't always see until you stumble right into them. And sometimes those traces hit you at exactly the wrong moment. When your heart is already open and afraid, turning a few crayon words into something that can freeze your blood long after the wall itself has been painted clean. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. A group of my friends had planned a weekend trip to a remote cabin owned by one guy's cousin. When they described the place to me, it sounded like something out of a survival show. There were no roads leading to it at all. You had to park your car at a trailhead and hike for most of a day through the woods to reach it. That alone made the trip feel like an adventure before it even started. The problem was my work schedule. I couldn't get out of my shift early enough to leave with the rest of them. They all headed up that morning while I stayed behind, watching the clock crawl forward. The plan we worked out was simple. I would leave later in the afternoon and hike as far as I safely could before dark. The last part of the trail was steep and narrow, and I'd never been on it before. Everyone warned me not to try that section at night. So I'd camp alone, then finish the hike in the morning. At the time, the idea didn't scare me. If anything, I was excited. I'd camped plenty of times with other people, but I had never camped completely alone. There was something appealing about the quiet and the independence of it. I imagined a peaceful night under the stars, a campfire crackling, the woods calm and still around me. It felt like a chance to prove to myself I could handle it. By the time I reached the trailhead and started hiking, the sun was already sinking lower in the sky. The air had that crisp mid-autumn chill to it, the kind that makes every breath feel sharp and clean. Leaves crunched under my boots as I moved deeper into the forest. The farther I walked, the more the outside world seemed to fall away. No cars, no distant highway noise, no voices. Just wind in the trees and the steady rhythm of my steps. As the light faded, I began looking for a good place to stop. I didn't want to be setting up camp in total darkness. Eventually, I found a small clearing just off the trail, maybe 40 feet across. It was surrounded by thick trees on all sides like a natural bowl. It felt sheltered and private. I dropped my pack and decided that was where I'd spend the night. Setting up camp gave me something to focus on. I gathered wood, built a small fire, and pitched my one-person tent near the edge of the clearing. The firelight flickered against the trunks of the trees, making shadows dance in strange shapes. I cooked hot dogs over the flames and made sloppy, melted s'mores that stuck to my fingers. Sitting there alone, eating warm food with the fire crackling, I felt oddly proud of myself. It was quiet in a way I rarely experienced in normal life. But after a while, I started noticing sounds. At first, it was easy to ignore. Forests are never truly silent. There are always animals moving, branches shifting, leaves falling. I told myself that was all it was. Something small scurrying around in the undergrowth. Maybe a raccoon or a fox attracted by the smell of food. Still, the sounds kept coming from the same general area, the edge of the clearing. I tried not to stare into the darkness too much. The fire only lit a small circle around me. Beyond that circle, The woods were pitch black. My imagination began filling in shapes that weren't really there. Every time a twig snapped, my shoulders tightened. I laughed quietly at myself, embarrassed by how jumpy I was getting. Then I realized something that made my stomach drop. Whatever was out there wasn't just wandering randomly. It was moving in a pattern, circling. Once I focused on it, I could track the sound as it moved from one side of the clearing to the other. Leaves crunching. A pause, more crunching. It made a full loop, then another. I counted at least 4 or 5 laps. It was slow and deliberate, not the frantic darting of a small animal. It felt intentional. I stood up suddenly, the motion fueled by a burst of nervous energy. The instant I did, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sounds had been. After a few seconds, I heard something crashing away through the woods, fast and distant, like it was retreating. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My heart was hammering. I told myself it was just a curious animal that got scared when I stood. That explanation made sense. It had to make sense. I didn't want to invent something worse. Deciding it was time to sleep, I doused the fire and crawled into my tent. Without the firelight, the darkness felt absolute. The thin fabric walls suddenly seemed fragile, a flimsy barrier between me and the entire forest. I zipped the tent closed and lay on my back, listening. Sleep didn't come easily. I drifted in and out of that half-awake state where your thoughts blur into dreams. In that state, I sometimes hear things that aren't real. Random voices, echoes of conversations, nonsense sounds. It's happened to me before, so when I first heard a whisper, I assumed it was just my brain misfiring. Then I woke up fully. The whisper was still there. It was right outside my tent. Every muscle in my body locked. I didn't breathe. The voice was low, just above a whisper, speaking in a rhythm I couldn't understand. I couldn't tell if it was another language or if it was English spoken in a strange, slurred way. The words blended together into something soft and unsettling. I lay there frozen, staring at the ceiling of the tent. The moonlight outside was faint, but enough to outline the fabric. I could see shadows shifting slightly as something moved close by. Time stretched. It might have been seconds or minutes. I had no sense of it. All I knew was that someone was standing inches from me. Then I saw it. A hand pressed into the wall of the tent near my foot. The fabric indented around the shape of fingers, clear. Human. There was no mistaking it. The sight snapped me out of my paralysis. I bolted upright with a gasp, and in that exact moment, whoever was outside exploded into motion. I heard them sprinting away through the woods at full speed, branches snapping, leaves tearing underfoot. For a few seconds, I just sat there shaking. My ears rang with the sudden silence that followed. My brain struggled to catch up with what had happened. Finally, running on pure adrenaline, I grabbed my flashlight and ripped the tent open. The beam cut through the darkness in a thin white line. I swung it wildly across the clearing. Trees, bushes, empty space. Nothing moved, nothing answered. It was like the forest had swallowed the person whole. I stepped out barefoot, the cold ground biting into my skin, and checked the side of the tent. I expected to see a muddy or bloody handprint, some proof that it wasn't my imagination. But the fabric was clean, smooth, untouched. That almost scared me more. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat with my back against a tree, flashlight in my lap, jumping at every sound. The woods felt different now, hostile. Every rustle seemed loaded with meaning. I watched the sky slowly lighten through the branches, counting the minutes until morning. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, I tore down my camp in record time. My hands shook as I packed. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just shoved everything into my bag and started hiking. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following me between the trees. I didn't relax until I reached the cabin and saw my friends. The normal sound of their voices felt unreal after the night I'd had. When I told them what happened, they tried to joke about it. Said it was probably another camper messing with me. Maybe it was. I never found out. All I know is that I went into those woods excited to spend one peaceful night alone. And I came out understanding how vulnerable a thin layer of fabric can feel when you realize you're not as alone as you thought. I was about 15 minutes away from finishing a night shift when it happened. It was one of those slow, dragging nights where the clock feels broken and every minute stretches forever. The office sat in the middle of an industrial district, the kind of place that's busy and loud during the day, but completely dead at night. By 11:30 p.m., every other building around me was dark. No traffic, no people, nothing but empty streets and the hum of distant machinery. I was half zoning out at my desk when a massive crash exploded through the silence. It wasn't a small noise, it was violent. Glass shattering, echoing off the concrete walls. I jumped so hard my chair rolled backward. For a second, I just sat there, frozen, trying to process what I'd heard. My brain ran through explanations. Maybe something fell. Maybe a bird hit the windows. But I already knew it was worse than that. I forced myself up and walked toward the front of the building. Each step felt heavier the closer I got. When I turned the corner, I saw it immediately. One of the big front windows was smashed in. Shards of glass were scattered across the floor and sidewalk. And sitting in the middle of it all was a rock the size of a brick. Someone had thrown it straight through. The sight made my stomach drop. The street outside was empty. No headlights, no footsteps, no one running away. Just the quiet industrial night like nothing had happened. That almost made it creepier. Whoever did it was gone, and I had no idea how long they'd been watching before they acted. I stood there staring for a few seconds, listening hard for movement. Nothing. The silence felt thick, like the whole area was holding its breath. I backed away from the window and returned to my desk, trying to keep my hands steady. I called security and explained what happened. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I didn't want to stick around and wait. Suddenly, the office didn't feel like a workplace anymore. It felt exposed. I grabbed my stuff and headed for the exit. As soon as I stepped outside, the fear hit me all at once, and the parking lot was huge and empty, lit by a few flickering overhead lamps that left long shadows between the cars. Mine sat alone near the edge. The walk toward it felt endless. Halfway there, I started imagining footsteps behind me. I knew it was in my head, but the fear didn't care. My pace quickened. By the time I reached the car, I was running. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, locked it, and peeled out of the lot faster than I should have. My heart didn't slow down until I was several streets away. The drive home felt like surfacing from underwater. With distance came relief. I laughed at myself a little, embarrassed by how badly I'd spooked myself. It was just vandalism. Some bored idiot throwing rocks. That's all. I was almost home when a thought slid into my head so casually, it took a second to land. I didn't remember unlocking the car. My hands tightened on the wheel. I replayed the moment in the parking lot. Running, opening the door, jumping in. But I couldn't picture hitting the unlock button. I tested the memory again and again. Nothing. A cold prickle spread across my neck. I reached back blindly with one hand and swept it across the back seat without looking, half joking with myself, half terrified I'd feel another person. My fingers touched empty air. No one there. I checked the mirrors. Nothing. The car was quiet except for the engine. Still, the realization sat heavy. The car had been unlocked the entire time, sitting alone in a dark industrial lot. I told myself it was coincidence, carelessness. I probably forgot to lock it earlier in the day. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd mostly convinced myself it was nothing. I went inside, shook it off, and tried to reset my night. About 30 minutes later, I was restless. I called a friend, and he told me he was out drinking nearby. The idea of sitting alone in my house suddenly felt worse than going out. So I decided to meet him. I grabbed my bike and headed back into the night. The air was cool and clear. The streets were mostly empty, washed in pale moonlight. Riding helped burn off the leftover tension. I wasn't in a hurry. I pedaled lazily, enjoying the quiet and the rhythm of the wheels on pavement. That's when I heard another bike behind me. The sound slipped into my awareness slowly. Tires rolling. A chain clicking softly. Someone was gaining on me. I straightened up and moved to one side of the road to let them pass. As the rider came alongside me, he slowed down instead of speeding up. For a second, we rode side by side. He turned his head and smiled at me. I've never seen a smile like that before, or since. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't drunk. It was stretched too wide, too deliberate. Like someone practicing how to look human and getting it slightly wrong. The expression hit me with a wave of instinctive dread. My whole body recoiled before my brain caught up. He kept riding. I watched him pull ahead, my heart suddenly pounding again. That's when my eyes focused on the bike, the shape of the frame, the color, the worn tape on the handlebars. It was my mom's bike. The recognition slammed into me so hard I almost swerved. There was no doubt. I'd seen that bike 1,000 times. He was riding it like it belonged to him, pedaling calmly down the street under the moonlight. Every nerve in my body fired at once. I spun my bike around and sprinted home as fast as I could. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they were ripping open. I didn't look back. The image of that smile chased me the entire way. When I reached the house, I barely managed to stop before crashing into the driveway. I threw my bike down and ran to the garage. Empty space. The spot where my mom's bike should have been was bare. My chest tightened. I turned toward the car parked nearby. One of the doors was open, the back left door. I stood there staring at it, trying to remember ever opening it. I hadn't. I'd been driving alone. There was no reason not to touch that door. A sick realization crawled through me. My car had been unlocked in that parking lot. Someone could have opened the back door and hidden inside. Someone could have been sitting inches behind me during that entire drive home, watching, waiting, then slipping out when I went inside, taking the bike, and leaving like it was all part of a plan. I checked the back seat again, even though I already knew it was empty. The upholstery looked normal, no signs of struggle, no proof. Just that open door and the missing bike. I stood in the driveway for a long time, listening to the quiet neighborhood. Everything looked peaceful, normal. But the normalcy felt fake, like a thin layer covering something rotten underneath. I never saw the guy again. We never got the bike back. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing useful. Just a series of moments that lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. What sticks with me the most isn't the theft. It's the idea that for some unknown stretch of time, a stranger may have been inside my car with me, close enough to reach out and touch my shoulder, close enough to whisper, close enough to do anything. And I wouldn't have known until it was too late. Even now, years later, I still check the back seat before I drive. Every single time. Not because I expect to find someone there, but because once you've felt that kind of possibility settle into your bones, it never fully leaves. Some fears don't fade. They just become part of the routine. I was a kid when this happened. The kind of age where you're old enough to stay up late without permission, but still young enough to feel like the world is bigger and stranger than anyone admits. I had this cheap little radio I was obsessed with. It wasn't fancy, just a scratched plastic thing with a stiff tuning dial that crackled every time you turned it. But to me, it felt like a portal. I loved the idea that invisible signals were flying through the air all the time, carrying voices and music and messages from places I'd never seen. One weekend, I decided I wanted to make it stronger. I had read somewhere that a bigger antenna could pull in distant stations, so I started digging through the garage and found an old television antenna that had been sitting in the corner for years. It was dusty and bent in a few places, but it still looked usable. I dragged it outside, climbed up on a chair against the side of the house, and propped it up as high as I could manage. Then I ran a long piece of wire from it, threading it carefully through my bedroom window. I didn't really know what I was doing. I just attached the wire to the radio's antenna with an alligator clip and hoped for the best. When I turned the radio on, the difference was immediate. The static sounded deeper, fuller. As I twisted the dial, stations I'd never heard before slid into focus. Distant music, faint talk shows, bursts of languages I didn't recognize. It felt like I'd unlocked something secret. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet in that heavy late-night way where every tiny noise seems louder than it should. I checked the clock and saw it was around 2 a.m. Instead of trying to force myself to sleep, I reached over and picked up the radio. I kept the volume low, just loud enough to hear through the silence. I started slowly sweeping through the frequencies. There's a strange comfort in late-night radio. The static becomes a kind of background ocean, and every now and then a voice or a melody rises out of it like something surfacing from deep water. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, turning the dial millimeter by millimeter. Sometimes I'd stop and listen to a fragment of a song or a distant conversation before drifting on to the next signal. Then I landed on a station that didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. At first, I thought it was just interference. A dry, crackling noise filled the speaker, but it wasn't random. It had a pattern, a rhythm. It reminded me of snapping knuckles or the popping of cereal and milk, except it was steady and deliberate, like someone tapping out a code I couldn't understand. I froze with my hand still on the dial. The sound repeated over and over. Crackle, 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 each burst perfectly spaced. It didn't fade or drift like normal static. It stayed locked in place, sharp and focused. I turned the volume up just a hair, straining to hear if there was anything hidden inside it. The rest of the house felt impossibly far away. My parents were asleep down the hall. The air in my room felt thick. The radio's tiny speaker seemed louder than it should have been, like the sound was pressing against my ears instead of flowing into them. I listened for maybe 10 seconds. Then the crackling stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was sudden and complete, like someone had cut a wire. For a split second, I wondered if I'd lost the signal. I almost turned the dial again. That's when I heard the voice. It was faint. So faint, I thought I imagined it at first. A whisper riding the edge of the static. I held my breath and leaned closer to the radio. It doesn't work. The words were flat and tired, like they'd been repeated too many times. There was a small pause, just long enough for my brain to start forming questions. We're already dead. We're already dead. The voice wasn't screaming. It wasn't dramatic. That's what made it so much worse. It sounded resigned, matter of fact, like someone stating a simple truth they'd accepted a long time ago. For a moment, I didn't react. My mind lagged behind my ears, trying to fit the words into something logical. A prank, a weird broadcast, a snippet of a movie bleeding into the signal. But the tone didn't match anything familiar. It didn't sound like acting. It sounded intimate, like the voice was speaking directly into the room. Then the meaning hit me all at once. My chest tightened, and a jolt of fear shot through me so hard my hands went numb. I jerked back from the radio like it had burned me. The sound dissolved back into static, but I couldn't unhear what I'd just heard. The words echoed in my head, louder than the speaker ever was. We're already dead. I nearly threw the radio across the room. The urge to get it as far away from me as possible was overwhelming. Instead, I fumbled with the power switch and shut it off. A sudden silence rang in my ears. I sat there in the dark, heart hammering, eyes staring at the black shape of the radio on my nightstand. Every shadow in the room felt alive. I told myself it was just someone messing around with a transmitter. Late-night radio has always been full of weird hobbyists and pirates broadcasting whatever they want. That had to be it. Some edgy joke. Some experimental audio project. There was no other explanation that made sense. But knowing that didn't calm me down. I kept expecting the radio to turn itself back on. I kept imagining that voice whispering again. Not from the speaker this time, but from somewhere inside the room. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and lay there, eyes wide open, listening to the house. Every creak of the floorboard sounded intentional. Every gust of wind against the siding felt like a hand brushing the walls. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, everything looked normal again. Sunlight filled the room. The radio sat there harmlessly, just a cheap plastic object. I almost laughed at how badly I'd scared myself. In daylight, the memory felt smaller, like a dream fading at the edges. But I couldn't bring myself to turn it back on. For days afterward, I avoided touching that dial at night. I still used the radio during the day, but once it got late, I unplugged it and set it face down on my desk. I never heard that station again. I tried to find it a few times out of curiosity, sweeping the same range where I'd landed before, but all I got was ordinary static and distant music. Even now, years later, I can still hear that voice if I think about it too clearly. Not the exact sound, but the feeling of it. That quiet certainty. That impossible sentence delivered like a confession. I'm sure there's a rational explanation. There has to be. Someone experimenting with audio. A fragment of a broadcast drifting across frequencies at the right moment. Radios pick up all kinds of strange things under the right conditions. But at 2 a.m. in a dark room, with the whole world asleep and a voice slipping out of the static to tell you something like that, logic doesn't matter much. In that moment, it felt like I'd tuned into something I wasn't supposed to hear. Like I'd accidentally brushed against a conversation happening somewhere just outside the edge of reality. And once you've had a moment like that, it sticks with you. Every time I pass through static now, part of me still expects that rhythm to return, that crackling pattern, that whisper waiting behind the noise. About a year ago, I did something that sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, but it made perfect sense at the time. It was around 4:30 in the morning, one of those quiet, blue-black hours where the world feels paused. I had just walked a girl I was seeing out to her car. I stood in the driveway watching her taillights disappear down the street, waiting for the usual "I'm home" text before I went back inside. The air was cool and clean, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay outside a little longer. Everything was still. No traffic, no birds yet, just that deep pre-dawn silence. I've always been the kind of person who climbs things for no good reason. Trees, fences, rooftops, when I was younger. That night, the tree in my front yard looked especially inviting. It was big and old, known with thick branches that spread out over the sidewalk and street. I'd climbed it 100 times growing up, so while I waited for the text, I hoisted myself up and settled into a comfortable fork in the branches about 15 feet off the ground. From up there, I had a clear view of the street. Most of the houses were dark. Porch lights glowed here and there, but nobody was awake. That's when I noticed my neighbor's gate. They were the type of people who locked everything religiously. The gate was large, metal, and opened directly to the road. Behind it sat a neat little yard with a tool shed, a lawnmower, and a collection of expensive equipment that screamed "easy target" to anyone looking for trouble. And that night, the gate was wide open. It immediately stood out. I remember staring at it, running through explanations. Maybe he forgot. Maybe someone came home late and didn't latch it. It happens. Still, seeing it open at that hour felt wrong, like spotting a door ajar in a building that should be sealed tight. From my perch, I had a perfect angle on it, and I found myself watching the empty street and the open gate, like I'd accidentally taken on night watch duty. A pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the road. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Cars pass. But this one slowed way down as it approached. Not normal slow. The kind of slow where the engine barely hums and the tires whisper against the pavement. It rolled closer and closer until it came to a stop right in front of my neighbor's driveway. My stomach tightened. From above, I could see into the car just enough to make out 2 young guys in the front seats. They weren't talking casually or checking phones. Both of them were turned toward the open gate, scanning the yard. Their heads moved in that sharp, alert way people have when they're sizing something up. Even in daylight, it would have looked suspicious. At 4:30 in the morning, it felt like I was watching the opening scene of a crime. I stayed perfectly still. Part of me wanted to yell something, to scare them off, but fear glued me to the branch. I was suddenly very aware of how exposed I was. If they looked up, I'd be a silhouette against the sky. I shifted my weight slightly, trying to sink back into the leaves, and the branch creaked under me louder than I expected. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet. That's when the passenger looked up. Our eyes met instantly. Even from that distance, I could see his expression change. His head jerked back in a panicked double-take, like his brain refused to accept what it had just seen. A second later, he snapped forward again, staring right at me. His mouth opened wide, and I didn't hear the words, but I knew exactly what he said. It was written all over his face. He punched the driver hard in the arm, pointing up at the tree. I had about half a second to decide how to react. Running wasn't an option. I was in a tree. Hiding was pointless. They'd already seen me. Something primal took over. Some dumb instinct that said if you can't flee, be weird, be threatening, be something they don't understand. So I raised my arms slowly and curled my fingers into claws. Not a plan, not a strategy. Just the first thing my brain produced. I hunched forward a little, letting my silhouette stretch and warp through the leaves. In my head, I imagined I looked like some twisted creature perched in the branches, watching them. The driver looked up. He did the same double take as his friend, and the fear on his face was immediate and pure. He didn't hesitate. His foot slammed down and the car roared to life, tires chirping as it shot down the street. They didn't just leave. They fled. The sound of the engine faded fast, swallowed by the night, and then the street was silent again. I stayed frozen for a few seconds, arms still raised like an idiot gargoyle. Then the adrenaline hit. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I lowered my arms and let out a shaky laugh that sounded way too loud in the quiet. The absurdity of what just happened crashed into me all at once. I was a grown adult crouched in a tree at dawn, accidentally role-playing as a forest demon to scare off would-be thieves. My phone buzzed in my pocket. "I'm home." The timing was perfect. I texted back automatically, fingers still trembling, and looked down the empty street where the car had disappeared. The gate next door sat open, innocent and quiet, like nothing had happened. If someone had stepped outside right then, they'd have seen a peaceful neighborhood under early morning light. No sign of the tension that had filled it minutes before. I climbed down slowly, every rustle of leaves sounding louder than it should. Once my feet hit the ground, the world felt strangely normal again. I stood there for a moment, listening. No engines, no footsteps, just the distant hum of the city waking up somewhere far away. I walked over and shut my neighbor's gate. The metal latch clicked into place with a final, satisfying sound. I didn't know them well, but I knew they'd appreciate it. As I headed back to my house, I kept picturing the look on those guys' faces. That instant of pure confusion and fear when they saw a human-shaped thing perched silently in a tree at an hour when nobody should be awake. I like to imagine they told that story later. Two guys creeping through a neighborhood before sunrise, spotting an easy target, and then looking up to find some clawed silhouette staring down at them like it had been waiting. I hope it unsettled them. I hope it made them think twice about pulling into another driveway like that. Because from my side of the street, I wasn't a hero or a guardian. I was just a bored idiot killing time in a tree. But for a few seconds in the dark, I got to be the creepiest thing they'd ever seen. And honestly, that thought still makes me smile. When I was at university, I lived in one of those standard student halls that all look the same, no matter what country you're in. Long beige corridors, identical doors, thin carpet that never quite smelled clean, and a constant low hum of other people living their lives just a few feet away. But inside my room, it felt isolated. Once the door was closed and the lights were off, it might as well have been a box floating in empty space. I had just moved in, and everything still felt unfamiliar. The walls were bare, except for a poster I hadn't bothered to straighten. My desk was cluttered with cables and notebooks I hadn't opened yet. The bed was pushed into the corner under a narrow window that looked out onto a parking lot. During the day, the place felt harmless. Just another temporary student room. At night, it changed completely. The first night I heard the voices. I was lying on my back, staring at the ceiling. It was that in-between state where your body is tired, but your brain is still drifting, replaying the day in fragments. I remember thinking about classes, about the awkward introductions, about how strange it felt to suddenly live away from home. The building had settled into late-night quiet. No doors slamming, no footsteps in the corridor, just a soft electrical silence. That's when I became aware of talking. It was so subtle at first that I thought it was part of a dream forming. Two voices, maybe three, speaking in low tones. Not whispering exactly, but hushed, like people talking in a library or at the back of a church. The sound wasn't coming through the wall. I'd grown up in shared housing. I knew what muffled neighbors sounded like. This was different. It felt close. Inside the room, my eyes opened slowly. The voices were still there. They weren't loud. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of conversation. A gentle rise and fall, pauses where one voice would stop and another would respond. It sounded casual, comfortable, like I'd walked in on a group already deep into a discussion. I held my breath and listened. The moment I fully focused on them, they changed. The talking softened instantly, like whoever was speaking realized I was paying attention. The voices didn't stop, but they shrank into something thinner, harder to locate. I sat up in bed, and the sound smeared into the air, impossible to pinpoint. It wasn't coming from the door. It wasn't coming from the window. It was just there. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up. Silence. Not a gradual fade. A clean cut. The room went dead quiet, the way a recording studio must feel when the power drops. I stood there in the dark, heart ticking faster than it should have, waiting for the voices to resume. They didn't. After a minute, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. That half-sleep state can do weird things to your senses. I laughed it off, got back into bed, and eventually drifted off. The next night it happened again. Same position, same slow slide towards sleep. And again, right at the edge of unconsciousness, the voices returned. This time I recognized the pattern immediately. Calm conversation. Multiple speakers. No urgency, no emotion, just steady talking. The familiarity of it made it worse. It meant the first night hadn't been a fluke. I stayed perfectly still and tried to listen without reacting. The sound seemed clearer when I didn't move. I could tell the voices were speaking a language I didn't understand. The syllables were smooth and fast, flowing into each other in a way that felt European. At the time, I couldn't place it. All I knew was that it wasn't English. A chill crept up my arms. The logic part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Someone left a TV on, a radio in another room, pipes carrying sound. But again, it didn't feel distant. It felt contained inside my walls, like the air itself was speaking. I opened my eyes slowly, trying not to break whatever fragile state I was in. The voices dropped instantly to a faint murmur. I sat up. They thinned further, dissolving into a ghost of sound I couldn't chase. I turned my head from side to side, trying to triangulate it. Nothing. The room looked completely normal. My laptop was closed and unplugged on the desk. No radio. No phone playing audio. Just furniture and shadows. I got up and checked the hallway. Dead quiet. That night, I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, the voices would creep back, and every time I became fully awake, they would retreat, like shy animals slipping back into hiding. By morning, I was exhausted and embarrassed by how shaken I felt. It was just sound. There had to be a simple reason, but it kept happening. Night after night, the same pattern repeated. As I relaxed into sleep, the room filled with soft foreign conversation. It was never aggressive or frightening in tone. If anything, it sounded leisurely. People chatting about nothing important. That normality made it deeply unsettling. My brain kept insisting, if this were a dream, it would change. But it didn't. It was consistent, like tuning into the same station at the same time every evening. I started experimenting. One night I lay there with my eyes open, determined not to fall asleep. I waited. Nothing happened. The room stayed silent. My eyes burned with fatigue. The moment I let myself drift, just a little, the voices slipped back in. It was like they lived exactly at the border of sleep and waking, a place I couldn't hold on to for long. I checked everything electrical in the room. I unplugged my laptop completely. I turned off the lights at the breaker. I even sat in total darkness, listening to my own breathing, waiting for the sound to start. And still, when sleep approached, there they were again. By the end of the first week, I was convinced I was losing my mind. I didn't tell anyone. How do you even start that conversation? Hey, I think my room talks at night. I pictured the concerned looks, the jokes, the awkward silence. So I kept it to myself and grew more tired each day. The voices never threatened me. They never addressed me. They just talked around me, ignoring me completely, which somehow made it feel worse. I wasn't part of it. I was just trapped in the same space. The breakthrough came by accident. One evening, I was rearranging my desk, trying to make the room feel less temporary. I unplugged my speakers to move them and noticed the cable was frayed near the base. The insulation had peeled back just enough to expose a thin line of wire. I frowned, realizing I'd probably been lucky not to short something out. I didn't think much of it until that night. I fell into bed exhausted and waited. Sure enough, as I drifted, the voices returned. But this time I heard something new underneath them, a faint hiss of static. Not loud, just enough to notice once I was listening for it. The sound felt electronic. I sat up and followed the noise. It was coming from the speakers. They were turned off. No power. The laptop was shut down. And yet pressed close to the speaker cone, I could hear it clearly. The same low conversation, filtered through a whisper of interference. The voices weren't in the air. They were inside the hardware. Relief hit me so fast I almost laughed. The damaged cable had turned the speakers into a crude antenna. With no current flowing, they were acting like a radio receiver, picking up a distant broadcast. That's why it only happened at night. During the day, the speakers were powered and behaved normally. At night, unplugged and idle, they transformed into something else entirely. Once I understood that, the fear drained out of the experience, replaced by fascination. I lay there listening on purpose, no longer scared, just curious. The language clicked into place. French, a late-night talk program, maybe. The host chatting softly while the rest of the world slept. All that terror, all those sleepless nights. And the explanation was a torn piece of insulation and a lucky frequency. I fixed the cable the next day. That night, the room was silent for the first time since I moved in. No voices, no murmurs, just the ordinary hush of a building at rest. And yet I remember lying there, feeling a strange kind of disappointment. For a week, my room had felt haunted by invisible conversations drifting in from nowhere. It had scared me more than I liked to admit. But it had also made the world feel bigger, weirder, full of hidden signals brushing past us all the time. Fixing the cable restored my sleep, but it also closed that accidental window. Even now, whenever I hear faint radio chatter or distant static late at night, I'm taken right back to that room. That thin line between logic and fear. That moment when something impossible suddenly becomes explainable, but leaves behind a trace of wonder anyway. We had just gone to see The Sixth Sense when it first hit theaters, back when everyone was talking about it and nobody would spoil the ending. It was one of those nights that felt like a little event. We'd only been in our new house for a couple of weeks, boxes still stacked in corners, the place not quite feeling like ours yet. Everything smelled faintly like fresh paint and cardboard. The house was quiet in a way our old apartment never was. No neighbors through the walls, no traffic humming outside, just space and silence. My wife had been on edge the entire drive home. She kept glancing into the dark stretches between streetlights, arms folded tight. like the movie had followed us out of the theater and was sitting in the back seat. I teased her about it at first. I wasn't scared. I felt that post-movie buzz, and I am the kind where you're more impressed than shaken. But the closer we got to the house, the quieter she got. When we pulled into the driveway, the porch light cast this weak yellow circle that barely touched the edges of the yard. The rest of the property was swallowed by darkness. We hadn't installed motion lights yet. The trees in the back looked like a solid wall of black. She didn't get out of the car right away. "Can you go in first?" she asked. I laughed. "Seriously?" She nodded, not smiling. "Just check the house." It wasn't really about believing anything was there. It was the mood. That lingering film tension mixed with the unfamiliarity of a new place. I could see she wasn't going to relax unless I humored her, so I grabbed the keys and did my best exaggerated brave man routine, marching up the steps and unlocking the door like I was entering a haunted mansion in a cartoon. The house greeted us with stillness. That empty house quiet is different from normal quiet. It feels like the air is holding its breath. Our footsteps echoed more than they should have. The living room was a half-unpacked mess of furniture and boxes casting long shadows in the dim lamplight we'd left on. Nothing looked disturbed. No broken windows, no open doors. Just our stuff, exactly where we left it. "See?" I called back. "All clear." "Check the rooms," she said from the doorway, not moving. I sighed, but I was smiling. Part of me enjoyed playing along. I went down the hallway, flipping on lights one by one. The master bedroom was fine. Closet empty except for our clothes. The spare room was stacked with boxes labeled kitchen and books in my messy handwriting. I even looked under the bed like a kid proving monsters weren't real. Each room I checked felt more ridiculous than the last. But there was also a tiny shift happening in me. The house was so quiet that every small sound felt amplified. The click of a light switch, the creak of the floorboards under my weight, the soft hum of the refrigerator far away in the kitchen. Once you start looking for something, even as a joke, your brain begins filling the silence with possibilities. The last place to check was the guest bathroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open, just a narrow, dark line between it and the frame. The bathroom light was off. From where I stood, it looked like a square of thicker darkness cut into the wall. I remember thinking we should really replace that bulb because the hallway light didn't reach inside at all. I pushed the door open casually. And right next to my head, inches from my ear, a scream exploded into the air. It wasn't a normal sound. It was raw and sharp and animal, loud enough that it felt physical, like it hit me in the chest. My entire body reacted before my brain did. I jumped back so hard I slammed into the opposite wall. My heart kicked into overdrive, a violent pounding that filled my ears. For a split second, I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what I was hearing. It was pure panic, the kind that wipes out every rational thought. I shouted something unintelligible. Down the hall, I heard my wife scream too, reacting to my reaction. The house that had been silent a moment ago was suddenly chaos. The sound kept going, a horrible, high-pitched wail that twisted my stomach. It took another second for my eyes to focus. The cat was wedged behind the bathroom door. She must have slipped in there earlier and settled down in the narrow space between the door and the wall. When I swung it open, her tail got caught in the jam and pinched. The scream was hers, not some ghostly horror from the movie, not an intruder, not anything supernatural. Just our cat in sudden, furious pain. I dropped to my knees and shoved the door back the other way, freeing her. She shot out like a furry missile, claws scrambling on tile, vanishing down the hallway in a blur. The scream cut off instantly, replaced by the thundering silence of my own heartbeat. My wife came running, eyes wide. "What happened?" What happened? The cat, I guessed. I got the cat. For a second, she just stared at me. Then the tension snapped, and we both started laughing. The kind of shaky, breathless laughter that comes after a scare. I had to sit down on the hallway floor because my legs felt weak. My hands were trembling. It was ridiculous how hard my body had reacted. All that fear, built up by a movie and an unfamiliar house, had been waiting for a spark. The cat, offended and traumatized, hid under the bed for the rest of the night. We coaxed her out later with treats and apologies she absolutely did not accept. She kept her distance, tail puffed up, shooting me betrayed looks from across the room. Even after we calmed down, the house felt different. Not haunted, not threatening, just charged. Like we'd briefly peeled back a layer of normal life and seen how thin it was. A door opening, a sound in the dark. Your brain fills in the worst possible story in an instant. Logic arrives late, jogging behind your instincts. We double-checked the bathroom before bed that night. We checked every door, every corner, not because we believed in ghosts, but because adrenaline leaves habits behind. When we finally lay down, the house creaked and settled around us. Every small noise made me think of that scream again, how close it had been to my ear, how real the fear had felt. Years later, we still talk about that night. Not because anything paranormal happened, but because it was such a perfect collision of mood and timing. A scary movie. A new house that didn't feel like home yet. Darkness, silence, and then a sound so intense it cut straight through reason. For a moment, I understood exactly how people convince themselves they've seen something impossible. Fear doesn't ask for evidence, it just kicks the door in. And honestly, the worst part wasn't thinking there was a ghost. It was the instant, sickening realization that I'd hurt the cat. That flash of guilt hit almost as hard as the fear. Even now, I can still remember the exact pitch of that scream. It's burned into my memory in a way the movie never was. We laugh about it now, but every time I open a door that's been closed for a while, I still do it a little slower than I used to, just in case there's a tail hiding where I can't see it. I still think about that day sometimes, and I don't think it's the kind of memory that ever really fades. It was supposed to be an ordinary day off. Nothing dramatic, nothing special. Just one of those rare weekdays where both my wife and I were free from work at the same time, and we planned to use it to catch up on chores around the house. At the time, we lived in a townhome that backed right up against a stretch of woods. It wasn't deep wilderness, just a thick patch of trees that separated our row of homes from the next development. From our back door, it looked peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where you'd expect to see squirrels, maybe a deer if you were lucky, nothing more. The morning started like any other. We made coffee, talked about what we needed to get done, and stepped outside with that small sense of satisfaction that comes with being productive. The grass had gotten a little too long, and the flower beds along the fence were full of weeds. We had mulch bags stacked by the shed waiting to be spread. It was warm, but not unbearable. One of those days where working outside actually feels good for a while. Our yard wasn't very big. The grass took maybe an hour to cut if you went slow and did it neatly. I pushed the mower back and forth while my wife worked on the flower beds, pulling weeds and piling them into a bucket. We talked the whole time, just casual conversation about work, about what we wanted for dinner, about weekend plans, the normal rhythm of a married couple doing chores together. There was nothing strange in the air, no warning that the day was about to split into a before and after. When I finished mowing, I emptied the clippings into 2 large paper lawn bags. They were heavy and packed full. Normally, I'd drag them to the curb for pickup, but since we backed up to the woods and a lot of neighbors dumped yard waste there, I followed the same habit. It was only a few steps past the edge of our property. I picked up the first bag, walked a couple of feet into the tree line, and tipped it over onto an existing pile of grass and leaves. The woods smelled damp and earthy like they always did, and I didn't think twice about being there. It was routine. I walked back, grabbed the second bag, and headed in again. That's when I noticed something. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, something that didn't match the lines of the trees. Your brain is good at recognizing patterns, and this shape broke the pattern. It was in the middle of the woods, maybe 30 or 40 yards in, partially hidden by branches. And it was moving, not walking, not running, swaying. I stopped mid-step. The bag sagged in my hands, and I remember feeling confused more than scared. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. For a second, I wondered if it was a piece of trash caught in a tree, or maybe someone had hung a tarp or a bag that was catching the breeze. The movement was slow and rhythmic, back and forth. Something about it made my stomach tighten. I set the lawn bag down quietly and crouched a little, leaning forward to get a clearer view through the branches. My eyes adjusted, and the shape sharpened. The first thing I could make out clearly was a pair of shoes, sneakers. They were dangling a few feet off the ground, toes pointing down, gently swinging. My brain refused to finish the picture. It's strange how the mind tries to protect itself. Even as more details came into focus, I kept searching for a harmless explanation. Maybe it was a mannequin. Maybe someone hung clothes as a joke. But the longer I looked, the more undeniable it became. The legs above the shoes, the stillness of the body, the unnatural angle. There, in the middle of the woods behind our home, was a teenage boy hanging from a tree. Everything inside me went cold. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The world narrowed to that single image. His body was limp, completely slack, turning slightly with each breeze. His head was slumped forward in a way that told me, even from a distance, that he was gone. His dark, messy hair shifted gently in the wind. Next to the tree, leaning casually against the trunk like it had been set down with intention, was a skateboard. That detail hit me hard. The skateboard made it real in a way nothing else did. This wasn't just a body. This was a kid who had arrived there under his own power, a kid who had carried that board, maybe ridden it down the sidewalk, maybe past people who had no idea what he was about to do. I don't remember deciding to move. My body acted on its own. I spun around and screamed for my wife to call the police. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, thin and panicked. She must have heard something in it she'd never heard before, because I could hear her immediately scrambling inside, shouting back questions I couldn't answer. I was already running. Branches snapped under my feet as I pushed into the woods. Every step felt heavy and slow, like I was running through water. Part of me knew it was too late. His stillness told me that. But another part refused to accept it. I kept thinking, maybe there was a chance. Maybe I could lift him. Maybe I could do something. When I reached him, the air felt different, thick, quiet. The sounds of the neighborhood were gone, swallowed by the trees. Up close, there was no doubt. His body hung without tension. His arms were loose at his sides. His face was turned slightly away from me, but I could see enough to understand. There was no life left to save. I stood there helpless, my hands half raised, not knowing what to do. I didn't want to touch him. I didn't want to make it more real. The rope creaked softly with each sway. The skateboard rested against the tree like it was waiting for him to come back and pick it up. I remember talking out loud, though I don't remember what I said. Maybe I was apologizing. Maybe I was begging him to wake up. My thoughts were a jumble of horror and grief and anger at a world that could lead someone so young to that point. The police arrived faster than I expected. I heard sirens in the distance growing louder, cutting through the quiet. When they reached the edge of the woods, officers rushed in with urgent, practiced movements. They told me to step back. I stumbled away, my legs shaking, and watched from a distance as they worked. One of them climbed the tree with quick efficiency. Another stood below, arms ready. They cut him down gently. The whole scene felt surreal, like I was watching a movie I didn't want to be part of. My wife stood behind me somewhere, crying softly, her hand gripping my arm. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't look at anything except the ground. The image of him hanging was burned into my vision, replaying over and over no matter where I turned. The officers asked questions. I answered mechanically. Yes, we had just been doing yard work. No, we didn't know him. Yes, that's when I saw him. My voice sounded flat, like it belonged to someone else. Eventually they thanked us and told us we could go back inside. Just like that, they were gone, taking him with them, leaving the woods quiet again. But the quiet wasn't the same. Later we learned bits and pieces through neighbors and local talk. He'd been having trouble at home, fighting with his parents, feeling trapped in ways adults sometimes dismiss as teenage drama, but that to him must have felt unbearable. I kept picturing him choosing that tree, standing there with his skateboard, looking around at the same woods I'd walked into 100 times without fear. For weeks afterward, I couldn't step near that part of the yard without seeing it again. The swaying shape, the shoes, the skateboard. Ordinary objects turned into permanent symbols of that morning. Even the smell of fresh-cut grass brought it back because that was the scent in the air when I found him. What stayed with me most wasn't just the horror of the moment. It was the closeness of it. We'd been outside laughing, talking about dinner, completely unaware that a tragedy was hanging just yards away. Life and death sharing the same space without touching, until the moment they collided. I still think about that kid sometimes, about what his last walk felt like, about whether he hesitated, about whether he hoped someone would stop him. I didn't know his name. I never knew his full story. But for a brief, terrible moment, our lives crossed in the most intimate way possible. Some memories fade around the edges with time. That one hasn't. It sits there, clear and sharp, a reminder of how fragile people can be and how much pain can exist hidden just out of sight. And every time I walk past a quiet stretch of woods, part of me looks a little closer than I used to, as if I'm still trying to understand what I saw that day. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.